Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this ad hoc webinar on the China-Africa cooperation in 2025 and beyond. My name is Hussein Askari. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. There's an African saying which was cited by President Xi Jinping in the 2024 Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC, and it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go long, go together. Or if you want to go far, go together, which shows the spirit of cooperation and joint prosperity, which is held by both African nations and China. Now, while everyone is holding their breath in anticipation of what President Trump of the United States might do or not do on January 20, China and African nations are not wasting their time speculating. The Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Wang Yi, hit the ground running in 2025 with a tour which is still ongoing to 4 African nations, starting with Namibia, the Republic of Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. This is a tradition followed by Chinese foreign policy and foreign ministers for the past 35 years. That is visiting the African nations as the first activity of the year, which shows how important relations with Africa are for China. However, the main objective of the tour is not just symbolic, it is to follow up on practical steps to implement cooperation objectives and projects that were agreed upon in last year's China-Africa summit, the FOCAC. President Xi Jinping presented a 10-point program, pledged $50 billion in new investments in Africa in the next 5 years. But most importantly is what African nations and African leaders presented and actually demanded that the form of cooperation should take place, something which we will discuss today. So because the main subject of the FOCAC summit was not simply to get some support from China, but actually main theme was modernization and industrialization of Africa. So this brings the relations between China and Africa to a different level. The reason that we are interested here in Sweden as a Swedish and European institution, of course we deal with the Belt and Road Initiative, is that what is so important for us here in Sweden and Europe, the EU, in this kind of cooperation between China and Africa? Are we outside this world, which is being shaped by what people now call the Global South and the cooperation between nations in the Global South, or can we be part of that? This is something I'll bring up in my own presentation later, after our guests from Africa are going to speak. I'm very happy that we are joined by some of our African friends, Mr. Ikenna Imuwu from Nigeria, Dr. David Muniai from South Africa, and Mr. Martin Camara from Guinea. We also have the chairman of our own institute, Stephen Brower, joining us now. And as I said earlier, the fact that Mr. Wang Yi is visiting Nigeria, which is the only country represented here in our the webinar. So our guest from Nigeria may have the word first, also because he had some urgent work to do. Mr. Ikenna Imuwu, he's a China expert. I was happy to receive his book, Rise and Global Influence of in the 21st Century of China. Very valuable book. Thank you very much. And I would like to give you the word, Mr. Ikenna, if you can unmute yourself and let us know your thoughts on this development.
It's nice seeing your face once again. And I think Professor David Muniai is also linked up. We all met for the first time in Shanghai in September 2023, and it was a lovely meeting. Right now, Mr. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, is in Africa. He will trottle through 4 countries, and Nigeria is one of those 4 countries. Possibly his last car before returning to Beijing. From my records, this is the 35th year China is sustaining this tradition of having its first diplomatic trip to any country in the world in Africa. And it's a sign of sincerity and sustained friendship, so not a flash in the pan kind of thing. And for Nigeria, I will say that Nigeria is a major beneficiary of China aggression. That started or predates the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative of some 11, 12 years ago just added some verve to it. Now, Nigeria and China interact on a two-pronged platform, the FOCAC, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and the Belt and Road Initiative that later came. Even though our interaction with China started in 1971, February 10, when the two countries established diplomatic relations, there have been 53 full years of fruitful relationship. I remember one of the instances I cited in the book you showed us, Carrie, was my interview with a one-time Nigerian ambassador to China, who told me, Abubakar Wale, he told me frankly that even though diplomatic relationship is a two-way thing that is mutually beneficial, but he thinks that Nigeria has more to benefit from China than China does from Nigeria. Last year, we had a figure that was better than the previous years in trade relationship. That Nigeria's trade with China grew to about 23 billion US dollars. And with a more Nigerian component, that means narrowing down the gap, the deficit between the two. Though I have never worried about deficit between China and Nigeria. Trading is for those who have things to trade. And I don't think it is China that stops Nigeria from having goods to trade with the world. Generally, Africa needs to do so much about what they trade with the world. I think the volume of products Africa brings to the global market is 4%. That's not good enough. Even intra-Africa, that is where AFTA comes in handy and very important. Even within Africa, the African goods traded within the African market is just 16%. That's not good when Asia has 65% and Europe has 62%. So we need to do more. But China and Nigeria bring it closer. Nigeria has benefited a lot, just like China anyway, because it's a two-way thing. Nigeria is today Africa's largest contracting market for China. A lot of infrastructure contracting goes on here by Chinese companies that build a lot of things. What we call the Dangote petrochemical plant and Dangote urea plant that makes fertilizers it exports to many countries in Africa. And the petroleum refining it exports the products to many countries in Africa is embedded and located within what is called the Lekki Free Trade Zone in Lagos. Lekki Free Trade Zone is a brainchild of China's partnership with Nigeria in business relations. In 2023, January, the Lekki Deep Sea Port, that is going to be the largest in West Africa, was commissioned by President Buhari then. It was built by the China Harbor Engineering. At the last count, I think China's Civil Engineering Construction Corporation has completed at least 779 kilometers of railway in different contracting platforms for Nigeria's use. So Nigeria has got so much leverage. Yes, they are not free, but even though they are not free, I still remind you that about 75% of the funding comes from a partnership that is made possible through the China Exim Bank. that loan is repayable. That's okay. But when you invest your loan, which is a problem I always had with Africa and loans, when you take a loan and squander the goodwill, it is not beneficial. But whenever you take a loan and put it into beneficial use, even the next generation will not begrudge paying back, because all these things yield economic dividends and profits. When a loan is profitable, it's worth taking. So these projects are financed by Chinese Exim Bank, including, of course, the one that is about to come in the next 2 years. It's under construction. We call it it's a hydropower station in northern Nigeria. I think it will be the second largest hydropower station after the one in Ethiopia. So when it comes on board, I know it will solve a lot of the challenges of electricity deficit in Nigeria. Already the one built in Kainji is running, has added also to the electricity availability in Nigeria. So that of Mambila, it's Mambila Hydroelectric, is in Taraba State in northern Nigeria. The value is 5.8 billion US dollars. It's paid 75% by Chinese Exim Bank. Yes, Nigeria will repair, but there is a reason to take it and have electricity run your economy, because without electricity, you cannot run the economic system and it cannot grow. So many dimensions. Chinese impact in Nigeria's infrastructure development has played a key role. And I have to say it without drawing comparisons. I never knew a country, even those who started relationships with Nigeria like hundreds of years ago. I can't remember any of them making such impact in Nigeria's infrastructure development. And these things, apart from adding some verve to our economy, they also create employment. In 2018, I think the Chinese ambassador to Nigeria then said it factually that Chinese companies or companies owned by the Chinese and some in partnership with Nigerians inside Nigeria employed 200,000 local workers. And this is a very big addition, and we can't overlook it. So whatever anybody says, those of us who watch these things and know how they go, we know that for real, the relationship between Africa and China and relations between China and Nigeria is not a one-sided thing. It is not an exploitative adventure like many countries would want you to believe from the other side. I think Nigeria or Africa is old enough to know its friends and to choose who the friends should be. So it's not a situation where you tell me how to think and when to think. No. Whenever we get into a wrong relationship, we should be in a position to know. During the anniversary of the 50 years of diplomatic ties between Nigeria and China, I personally interviewed Nigeria's foreign minister, Geoffrey Onyama, in Abuja, right in his office. I raised the issue about the loan trap propaganda, asked him, why do you keep taking loans from China? He told me that before any country takes a loan on Nigeria precisely, it has to sample the capital exporting channels, the different channels that can provide capital or loans to any country that needs it, that is deficient. And whenever compare conditions, the conditions from China have always been the best, and that is why they go for Chinese loans. They don't encumber them with impossible conditions for repayment, because while they are part of the execution of the project, they make sure that no project is abandoned. And Chinese contracting companies don't have a single history of abandoning any project halfway. It doesn't exist. Nobody can point to any project Chinese contracting firms did halfway in Nigeria and left it completed. From the railway tracks to the international airport rehabilitation and expansions, to power projects, to bridges, roads, the seaports, and so on and so forth. None of them ever abandoned midway. They're all completed and they're all in use. The only one that is not really used may be faults of the users on Nigerian system that goes into use, because when they are completed, they hand over to the Nigerian system. Sometime early last week, the People's Bank of China published on its website that Nigeria has revived its currency swap with China, that's Central Bank of China. And the value of the latest revived currency swap is 2.09 billion US dollars, denominated in the renminbi or Chinese yuan. Now, what is the benefit? The benefit is that the Central Bank of Nigeria in 2018 said it that 35% of the forex it dispenses to Nigerians who do international business go to China. That means 35% of Nigeria's foreign trade volume is with China. The next to China is India, 5.8%. You can see the difference. So now the secure system of you exchanging your Naira into US dollars and later into renminbi when you get to China, it's meaningless. And it creates a monopoly by the US dollars over Nigeria's Naira. And every day, the Naira value is sinking in favor of the US dollars. So this swap will create an avenue, even though Nigeria had domiciled its foreign reserve 4% in renminbi since 2011. So this swap will create an avenue that the 35% of Nigerians who do business abroad or foreign countries, which is actually China, would within Nigeria don't need to get the dollar or pound sterling or euro before getting the renminbi. They will just exchange their Naira with renminbi directly from Nigerian banks, and it makes it shorter, and it keeps the monopoly and stranglehold of the US dollars over Nigeria's Naira that is weighing it down every day, mercilessly. So the reason we should have an open world is you try out the channels of friendship, whatever favors you go with it. So far, the Chinese friendship has favored Nigeria more than the rest. I think I will stop so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, for the other, both the panelists and for the audience, you may ask questions to the speakers, send them as they speak or when they finish to the Q&A session or in the chat. I will make sure that your questions are brought to the panelists and answered or discussed. Our next speaker is Dr. David Monyai from South Africa. But Dr. David, please, we would like you to share your thoughts with us on both the China-Africa cooperation and also the visit by Mr. Wang Yi to these 4 African countries. Welcome. You may present yourself first.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. A great pleasure. When you invited me, I thought it through, and I think it's good that we have our institutes collaborate across the African continent and abroad, particularly Sweden. Sweden carries a very important meaning to us in South Africa and across the African continent. So I'll try to go beyond just Africa, China, particularly within the ambit of BRICS, making the point that it's not just a global South. I think we're going to see more of quote-unquote non-global South countries joining BRICS soon. My name is David Monyai. I'm the Professor of International Relations. I'm the Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at University of Johannesburg. My area of specialization geopolitics. I look at Africa's international relation, look at China and the entire Asia, multilateral, and quite a number of other issues and security and so many others. We have quite a number of books that are out, but I mean, a book that perhaps that makes sense for this talk is a book that we have. I'll also write it down. Perspective on Africa-China Infrastructure Industrial Cooperation. It's a book that came out 3 years ago. It's quite relevant for a deeper understanding. And it's a great pleasure for my brother, Emewu, to see you and to share a platform with you.
Thank you.
So firstly, what I would like to do is perhaps to just put these 35 years that my brother has mentioned, visits by a Chinese foreign minister to Africa, the last 35 years, and try to put it in a much more context, in a global context. What is the meaning of these yearly visits, and where are we now within geopolitics? And what significance of China, Africa, for Africa itself as well as for China? I think the very first point that perhaps we should set out quite clearly is that the post-1945 world order is declining, and is declining much faster than we thought. And if one looks at what's happening in war in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening on our own continent, Africa itself, and also looking at strategic countries, United States included, and what's happening in Germany, one could say that the entire US Western world-led post-1945 world order has declined drastically. And I think what we're going to see in the near future with the second coming of President Trump in a matter of days, I think what we're going to see is that more dynamics are going to come in to accelerate what is already a process that, if one looks back, this process really started as far back as 2008 with the global financial crisis, and then accelerated by the COVID-19, and as well as wars of choice, whether it was the war in Iraq, or Syria and Afghanistan, the bombing of Sudan and Libya in 2011, and all these Western-led hegemonic wars of choice have led the world to what we are. Huge implication in the global economy, that regardless of the pickup of the economy, particularly the US, the health of global economy is not in good shape. I think it's worsening. There are other factors that we all know. The aging of the Western world, including China, that leaves Africa as a central place for politics and for economy and for quite a number of other issues that are of great importance. One, the African continent, it's a unique continent in the sense that it has 1.3 billion people. Even though its output in terms of contribution to world trade is at 4%, a small insignificant figure, it remains an important market and a future market. Unlike other markets and other continents, the African continent has the youthful population, those who are under 15, constituting the bulk of the population. And beyond population, the African continent has 60% of the global fertile arable land. As much as we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence, and all new issues that we talk about, basic agriculture will remain an important factor in the global politics, particularly in relation to food security. So it's quite important to see the centrality of Africa with all these factors. Beyond that, Africa also, from the past, the present, and in the future, Africa has been at the center of powering the capitalist system. Capitalism system in the sense, in the early phase, the entire slavery and colonial era, where plunder of African resources powered what we have, the industrialization of Europe, and the whole growth and economy of the US, as we know. Africa has been central to that. And within it is the issue of critical minerals. Africa has some of the large deposits of minerals of all sorts, particularly minerals that are critical to powering the fourth industrial revolution. So as we look into the future, we also need to look at Africa within this context, that it is a power, and therefore it is, as much as it relies to important actors such as the United States, the European Union, and other, Japan, China becomes an important, and the rise of China is of greater importance for Africa. For the mere fact that this is a country that in the 80s, my own country, South Africa, was much more ahead of China. It has powered its economy to the second biggest economy in 3-4 decades in a miraculous way through hard work of Chinese people and the lessons that Africa is looking at. And therefore, I think it is important, because the African factor, the China-Africa issue, there is a tendency among scholars, particularly in the West, where they look at Africa as a dependent, a continent without its own interest, a continent that is just following China blindly. I think I would like to assert and argue that Africa has agents, that's first, is interests. Africa is an active participant within global arena, particularly within the UN system. And therefore, I think the relationship between Africa and China, I wouldn't want to go into history. I think most of us are quite familiar with the history, has moved into stages, early phase, shared century of humiliation, both for Chinese by the Western world, and similarly, our own continent has also had a century of humiliation, and we share decolonization process, and China was in the forefront in assisting most African nationalist movements, such as in Tanzania, in Mozambique, and others in Southern Africa, and Algeria, and other places. And therefore, helping the continent at a time when China was extremely poor. And when it comes specifically to the question of projects, that is of great interest for this talk, the Tazara, which is the early phase of Belt and Road, in a different way during the Cold War. Both Zambian President Kenneth Kaunda then and Tanzanian President Mwalimu Julius Nyerere approached the World Bank, IMF, approached United States, approached European countries to request assistance in funding the Tazara rail, and they were rejected. And I think China was the last line of defense in the 70s, at a time where in Southern Africa, the apartheid South Africa, my own country, was under an apartheid regime, that South Africa remains the most industrialized country. In the past, even now, is the most industrialized country. And when it comes to infrastructure, it's way ahead of the rest of the continent. And in Southern Africa in particular, it used its transport system to subjugate the rest of the region, SADC, into its wishes of advancing apartheid, a system at a time when the ANC and other liberation movements were housed in Zambia and Tanzania and other African countries. And therefore, the Tazara project was a way of dealing with liberation of Zambia and Tanzania to less dependent on the apartheid government transport in terms of the goods from Durban straight into Zambia and Tanzania. And Tazara was meant to reach the sea using different ports other than the apartheid South Africa's ports at the time. This was a very successful project that up to now it remains an important historical site, and there's so many issues that has come that I would mention at a later stage. Now, having cleared that, the third and most important factor on Africa-China is the current era that we are in. That with the death of Chairman Mao in 1976 and the opening up of China up to 1978, China went from your ideological supporting nationalist movements to a much more pragmatic opening market-driven economy with the socialist Chinese characteristics, and that opening up, there was somehow a cooling off of the relation between the continent and Africa. I think things really started booming in year 2000 when we, for the very first time, we had the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. We also saw the rise by 2006, the China's Africa policy, real serious milestones of the relation. And the new era of this relationship that we're enjoying now, it goes beyond politics. It's not only driven by ideology. Ideologies, it's more pragmatism, markets, infrastructure, and of course there are relationships between the Chinese Communist Party and a number of communist parties on the African continent, including nationalist movements such as Chama cha Mapinduzi, ZANU-PF, Frelimo, and ANC in Southern Africa. So we see the trade volumes that has gone higher. The other element that is important in this era of the relationship between Africa and China of great note is that it came at a time when the Western world was in this triumphant mode. Fukuyama, end of history, and Africa was really seen as a hopeless continent, as per the Economist magazines of 2000. China saw an advantage of re-engaging the continent meaningfully and deal with these issues. And therefore, that yearly visit by the Minister Foreign Affairs was to cement this relationship. The Forum on China came into being, and quite a number of other. When it comes to South Africa, I think we also saw the relationship also strengthening, that China and South Africa shares quite a lot of platforms. They are both BRICS members. They are also in G20. They share same positions on issue of climate change. They work closely within the World Health Organization and with the broader United Nations, particularly on peace and security issues. And China plays a critical role on the African continent through the AU. Not only the construction of the AU headquarters, the Africa CDC, as well as deploying quite substantive number of troops in Africa peacekeeping missions, particularly in Sudan and a number of other areas. And therefore, we see an increased role of China with a number of African countries in terms of military cooperation, including Nigeria, that my brother in his book and other areas has touched on. There are a lot of relationship in terms of infrastructure. In relation to the Belt and Road, South Africa also was one of the countries that signed to the Belt and Road. And unfortunately, South Africa hasn't been that active for a number of internal reasons in terms of its economy and what's going on domestically. However, in principle, South Africa supports the Belt and Road. And I think we're going to see a takeoff of South Africa, China, Belt and Road, major infrastructure, particularly in the areas of rail and a number of other areas that are in the making and will be announced at some point. We are going to also see a continued collaboration between South Africa and China through these platforms, BRICS, WTO, and others, strengthening the African agenda, I think, on key and strategic areas. I think South Africa also has formidable state-owned enterprises, unlike other African countries, without the capacity, without the capital. South Africa's capital markets are quite formidable and not as big as China. And therefore, I think the relationship between South Africa and China is quite different. I think we might see certain elements of joint ventures working closely with China and compete as well, I think, in certain areas. And therefore, I think we've seen that South Africa treasures China's role as the last more than 15 years. China has been South Africa's trading number one. And what China has done for South Africa and the rest of the African continent, and these active yearly visits and relation in different platforms and different issues, is also something that we don't often talk about. That is what China, by massively injecting capital, people to people, and a number of intervention on the African continent, it has attracted other players outside China itself. We've seen others are driven by fear, others see opportunity. I think the norm is just to look at China, US competition with the Europeans. But I think at this stage, we need to be conscious and aware of what I consider as silent actors. I think we've seen the rise of Gulf states pouring resources on the African, and we shouldn't underestimate the role that these countries are also playing. I think this is to do with China's activity, opening up roads, opening up rail, harbors, airlines, and also playing a critical role in peace and security, such as the contribution of China on the Horn of Africa within Ethiopia, with a special envoy from China. So there are a number of areas where China's activity attracting Latin American countries as well, particularly Brazil, is also coming in big ways. And I think within that, we also see other Norwegian countries, your Sweden and others, coming in smaller way, in smaller project, but we cannot discount the role of others who are coming in helping power Africa's own quest for development. Going forward, what does it mean? Perhaps in the conclusion, in the interest of time, I have more to say, but perhaps in the question and answer session. We also have seen that we are entering in the second Cold War of a much more softer. And Africa, as was the case in the past, so United States and then Soviet Union, this particular Cold War, I think it's better for us to be very frank. It is a Cold War. It's not similar with the past Cold War. This is a Cold War of a special type. It's a Cold War that is centered around economy. It's a Cold War centered around technology. It's a Cold War centered around competition on a number of issues. And Europe it's in it, United States, and President Trump. And so the rise of BRICS, the rise of China, and we cannot talk about BRICS without China, will really bring in dynamics that Africa need to look into. So some of the concluding remarks that I would like to make is that as much as we say all this, we should not miss one major factor. Even for China itself, China-Africa relation is not anti-West, is not anti any other player. I think Africa itself looks at China in a similar way as it looks at the West. However, there are a number of areas where Africa's interests converge more with China, and in other areas, Africa's interests converge more with the West on particular issues, as well as the question of divergence, that there are some economic issues. But when it comes to issues of development, I think there's more convergence between China and Africa, and the relationship is growing. There's no turning back. It's attracting more. The economic governance system, politics, there might be divergence, manageable. China continues with non-interference. And we also see the arrogance and hegemonic behavior of former colonizers and hegemonic US, where at times they forget that the world is changing. You can't push Africa, as my brother mentioned, to choose, to ask Africa to think in the manner in which they are thinking, that because the United States or Europe is doing certain things, therefore you assume that all of us are following Europe or US. It is no longer the case. I think there's a new generation of Africans who are thinking first and foremost, as I said in the beginning, they are conscious of their own agents, they are conscious of their own interests, and they're going to peg their interest with any player who advances those interests. And they will stay away from other actors who do not advance their interests. So those players could be in the West or in the East. And perhaps I'll stop here and wish this seminar a success.
Thank you very much, Dr. David. This was really interesting and very thorough, deep-going analysis of the situation. But also, you raised some very important points, like Mr. Ikena did, is that first and foremost, Europe and the United States should not be out of Africa, but we have to change our attitude towards Africa, that African nations are grown up and they know what they have to do. They have their own aspirations, they have own development programs and projects, and what we can do here in Europe or the United States, like China is doing, is to empower and the African nations to implement their own goals. And one important point is that almost all the projects China is building in Africa, these are not proposed by China. These are projects which were part of the national and continental development plans of those nations. China is merely offering the capital, the technology, and so on to build these projects. So these are genuine African projects which China is building. And here in Europe, we should also respect Africa's own policies, its own, their own context and their own aspirations. We cannot impose these on them. So thank you very much for bringing up these issues. Also, the important thing is that Africa, we should change our attitude towards Africa, is that it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. And this is something the Chinese have understood. China is a great potential. By 2030, we'll have 3 billion young population in Africa. Imagine, it's just our next door. It's our next door, here in Europe. And the Chinese believe this is a very important, in addition, of course, to the natural resources and so on. So these are very important points for people to think about. So now we go from the extreme south of Africa, from South Africa, to the northeast of Africa with our friend and brother, Ahmed Mustafa from Egypt. Please introduce yourself, where you work, and please go ahead.
Sure. This is, do you hear me first?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon. Thanks a lot to the BRI initiative in Stockholm, Sweden, headed by Mr. Steven Salam from Alexandria, Egypt, and also my brother, Hussein Laskari, my younger brother, Dr. Hussein Laskari, for inviting me for this, and also to David, my brother from South Africa, Salam, from Martin, and Ikina, how are you? I'm very happy. I'm very proud to be amid you guys. You present, the top-notch mentalities of Africa, and that is my pleasure just to be with you discussing the issues in between, Africa from one side and China from the other side as partners. And I'm very adherent to what Mr. Hussein said a little bit before, that Africa already is a very promising, and it is the greater opportunity and the greater share in the world in terms of population, in terms of mentality, in terms of, the natural resources. But how to manage that and how to do that, this is exactly reflecting the presentation that I'm doing. Frankly speaking, I'm director and owner of Asia Center for Studies and Translation, and this is the first startup specialist in the Asian affairs, maybe in the world, established in 2017, and it was like a liaison between Africa and the new world order, especially China and Russia and things like that. I had a master from the Harvard School of Economics in Moscow, Russia, 2021. And now I'm carrying out my PhD. I already published my thesis concerning the new world order, China, Germany, and Russia. I was here talking about the Greater Eurasia, and this is exactly what Mr. Putin was talking about in 2020, but I perceived him in 2017 at the Rosky Dome or the Russian House in Cairo in such idea. The title here is about, bridging civilizations. And of course, you guys already talked about that and clarified, especially my brother David from South Africa. He clarified a lot, and also the others. Uniting China, Egypt, and Africa for Visionary 2030. That was the title. Here, for the introduction, for the matter of the bridging civilization, it's an ambitious initiative aimed to fostering a collaboration between China, Egypt, and Africa, because Egypt is a part of Africa, and we are against all the talks that Egypt is not belonging to Africa, because our history and our involvement, it was several times and several years ago. And if you time the golden era between Egypt and Africa, it was the time of the leader Jamal Abdel Nasser. As of the 50s, he was the initiator of the non-aligned movement and the African unity and the all such, unity of African, countries. Also, he helped a lot in just, having a greater stream from the soft power, including, the maybe the unions of writers from Africa and Asia and other projects. Once Egypt was the main country in the south, especially in this, we already streamed the radio even via the domestic and the local languages of the African countries. And I remember when I was in Senegal via Council of Developing Social Science Research in Africa, Kudisria, Dakar, Senegal, 2 times. I found a photo for Jamal Abdel Nasser and a photo also for our godfather, Dr. Samir Amin, who was a Pan-Africanist and was talking a lot about that Egypt should take a greater part in Africa and development of Africa, and Africa is not a problem. And he talked exactly similar to what Dr. Hussein really talked a little bit concerning the matter of indebtedness, concerning the matter of how to manage the resources, concerning the matter of how the African government should take the lead in this regard, and the unity should be very crucial issues, especially in negotiations with any other party in the world, whether it is the EU or America or China or whatsoever in this regard. And of course, they were right in their vision since the 16th of the last century. Therefore, we have to move to the next slide. Here, the matter of the cultural heritage, and of course, if we talk about China from one side and Africa from the other side, this cultural heritage and exchange is very crucial, because if we don't recognize each other profoundly, I think any kind of talks will never be feasible in the future. And this is exactly what what China, since the establishment of the FOCAC in 2020, was trying to do in several issues. Therefore, they already inaugurated several Confucius institutes, including and not limited to one at the Cairo University, that already graduating a lot of students in this regard who can speak Chinese in a good way, as well as to send students and technical people via scholarships to China. And we have statistics say that since 2020, since the 2000 until 2020, there were about 70,000 scholars from Africa to China. And this is China, the biggest country that digested students and scholars from Africa. And that was a good motive from China. It was unprecedented from the other countries in this regard. And that was like a bridge of the culture and things like that between China from one side and Africa from the other side, because Chinese most of the time trying to showing respect to Africa, trying to give a hand to Africa, and Africa should use such matter and sending more students to China just for a greater education and knowledge and things like that. And of course, this year, as we see, 2025 is the snake year. The snake year for Chinese means that we are a resilient country, we are a strong country, and we are a very flexible country, which is good for the African if we use such characteristics, especially in our talks with the Chinese in this regard. Economic collaboration, of course, all my friends are talking about, the economic collaborations, and we should have like greater synergies that drive innovation and gross joint ventures in technology, agriculture, and tourism, which can enhance prosperity, ensuring a sustainable future for all. I think this matter, especially the economics, and if you talk about that the majority of the African continent, we are from the youth of the younger generation. Here we are not talking about, the giant or the big industries or the heavy industries, which have like a turnover after 5 years or 10 years or things like that. But we should, even in African countries, once we try to talk to the Chinese, and especially because I have some activities with Chinese, whether as a researcher or as a writer or as a consultant in some projects with the Egyptian side or with the Arab side, we should focus also in the microeconomics, the SMEs, as well as the startups. Why we don't in our talks, especially in the field of the economics, because Africa is one of the biggest promising continent in this regard, with a majority of youth thinking about having pools and greater incubators with China in terms of the startups, and searching for the needs of our society, because now most of the younger generation, even the older generation, they are too much attached to the cell phone, especially the smartphones. Therefore, the startup facilitate a lot of things. At the same time, it helps in the matter of the employability for the African youth, because also we suffer from the unemployment in Africa. This is one of our great crisis here. Number two, these projects will help to stimulate the mentalities of the younger generation in Africa, because the younger generation in Africa, they are promising, but they need someone to give them a hand. Also, the micro projects. Here we talk about even the informal economy, which represents a big portion of the economy in Africa, even in Egypt itself. Also, we should give a hand for this, because if we remember the experience of the China, of this amazing trial of the China, especially in economics, the economy was based on the SMEs firstly, and then starting to boom. And I have here the story of Huawei as a company, and Mr. Wang Yi, the chairman of Huawei. First, he started to, he was a law student, but he studied the laws of the EU, of the United States, as well as in China. Therefore, he started to establish his companies up on this variety of laws, to know what exactly laws that should be tailored to my company, that I can work with, and to avoid the other laws that cannot be feasible for my company. Then he started to grow step by step, and now Huawei is one of the biggest companies in R&D, and having at least $25 billion in this regard. And Huawei employing about 25,000 of employees, and the company is totally owned by its own manpower. And Huawei is not in the stock market. And this is why the Americans, for example, or the Europeans cannot manipulate with a big company like Huawei, which is one of the pillars of the economics and development in China in this regard. That was a good example, just to mention to you, my dear friends in Africa. Also, the matter of education and knowledge, and here I give previous figures concerning that until 2020, before the pandemic of coronavirus, about 70,000 of students and technical persons already sent to Africa in terms of scholarships, and we need just to maybe double or triple this number, because without the proper knowledge, and I'm here, I try to focus on the term of knowledge, not education, because knowledge, that means that you have like a greater hub of information and data and things like that to know about, not to be adhered to a specific curriculum. And this is also like a message I'm sending to my friends in Africa, that just trying to make your curricula focus on the knowledge, not on the education, because knowledge, builds minds and mentalities in this regard. Therefore, these exchange programs and initiatives, as well as scholarship programs, help a lot Africa, and making like this cultural and civilizational, cross-pollination that took place in between Africa and China from the other side, and more understanding. Bearing in mind that, yes, I forgot to say that that China is the biggest foreign investors in Africa, and they expect to reach $1 trillion by 2030, or the vision of 2030 in Africa, because the Chinese, they know that Africa is the coming continent in this regard. And education and knowledge is a part of this, greater bridge between those big nations. I mean, China from other side and Africa from our side. For the sustainable development, and this is also another crucial point in my presentation, and I just came from the COP16 in Riyadh a few weeks ago, because it was by the beginning of December. Here we should focus on several projects that is needed in Africa and represent crisis in Africa. Especially we have the crisis of water, the crisis of agriculture, the crisis of food, and the crisis of energy. Because if you don't have such issues, you will not have a sustainable development. Once the Europeans or the Americans coming to Africa and they try to give some projects and things like that, they are asking for the ESGs. That means environmental, and society, as well as the governance factors that may attract any foreign investors in this regard. Chinese, they have a good model for this in several cities, including and not limited to, of course, Shanghai and other cities, as far as I saw in China, because you're trying to have maybe the right vegetative, cover for all the cities around. And I saw in Beijing recently, when I was in May in this Sino-Arab summit, this vegetative green, cover around Beijing, and I was surprised because it was like a big tree over there. But in Africa, Africa needs the energy. Energy could be made, and we have new and innovative ideas in this regard, because China is very progressed, especially in the nuclear power energy, which can create a big quantity of water for sustainable development. Because, for example, we have here in Egypt now the project of El Daba via Rosatom, the greater Russian company. If we focus to give such energy in water desalination, it will create the 70% of the need of the water in the whole Egypt. Therefore, the nuclear energy, it's a clear energy, and it helps a lot Africa, and it matches Africa, especially the countries that having, coasts throughout Africa. Therefore, we can create a lot of water in this regard. China now is a very great country in such kind of nuclear energy, and trying to exceed, they are exceeding France now, and via 2030, they may exceed the United States in the nuclear power energy plants in this regard, according to the latest statistics. And Dr. Yossi Abushadi, our Egyptian expert in this regard in IAEA. Also, for the matter of the solar energy, now we have a new technology which based on the hot sand, and that is matching the desert countries. I have a friend from Saudi Arabia. He's a professor called Hanin Ansari at King Saud University, who already worked in this project, and already they started to produce and generate kilowatts on the proper rates and acceptable rates in this regard. And this technology can match all the African countries, because all the African countries, they already desert, or the main parts of such countries representing, deserts, and can match such model of energy. Therefore, we don't have problem in this if we go in negotiations in such matter. Because if we talk about, yes, also we have the ordinary solar energy and the wind energy and things like that, but those, they are more feasible than the others, because the others also, they need a greater technology which costs us billions of dollars in this regard. And in order to reach the shift, especially in the green energy, via 2050, and here we had several experts interview, you need at least 800 billion US dollars just to make the blend of the green energy represent 40% of the whole energy resources that coming from the fossil and from the gas, or from the nuclear and the others. Therefore, I think these solutions already is very sustainable and matching with the African countries, especially in the matter of the energy and sustainability. Therefore, we talked about how much the energy can create the water, and water can create agriculture. Also, technology, and China, they have several technologies and how to grow the agriculture in farming field and things like that. We can use such technologies, especially for the young peasants or farmers or things like that. It could be applicable if we have the proper cooperation with the Chinese side in such field. Here I covered this point quickly concerning sustainable development goals and how to achieve it in Africa. Of course, the matter of upcycling and recycling also is crucial, and China and Africa could already develop such matter, because such waste could be also another source of energy. For example, especially the humanitarian waste. If we have like the methane incubators or things like that, or compactors, I think we can, because for example, Cairo and Alexandria, it is one of the biggest, cities in Africa reducing waste. And already Chinese, they already applied just to have a cooperation in this regard. Therefore, also waste could be another source of, energy in this regard, and we should focus how to treat such waste and transfer it into energy because it's very feasible economically. If you talk about, the technological transfer, here I also focus on companies like Huawei, just like we have the BYD and we have other companies that can now make a change in Africa, especially in terms of raising, the technology and things like that. But here also we have something to focus on because we already we're supposed to work in a project like Dot Africa, and all my African friends, they know that we have a lack in this. We have about 500 million of the Africans, they don't have this digital ID, and the Chinese companies and the Russian companies, Iranian companies, Pakistani companies, Malaysian companies can work jointly with Egyptian companies or with South African companies or the countries that have a development in this regard just to develop such projects, which is very crucial, and can develop other sectors, especially the banking sector and the financial services, because most of the foreign investors are suffering from the lack of the proper banking system in Africa, except some few countries like maybe Egypt, South Africa, things like that. Therefore, the technology will help a lot in this. Also, technology can help in the matter of the cybersecurity, because when I was in Senegal in 2015, there was like a piracy and hacking for the personal email of the president. And Dr. Abdallah Sisi, the legal advisor of the president, told us such case in this regard and said, if we really had like a Chinese partner in such matter, not the French, I think the emails will be of the president or the top level ministers or the cabinet will be intact. So the tourism, and here also we need more development and qualified personas in this regard in terms of the guides and infrastructure like the hotels that can digest millions of the Chinese tourists. The challenges, I think my brothers already talked about, because we have the vision of 2063 of our own Africa, because Africa also should have its own, image and sovereignty and full independence in this regard. In the conclusion, yes, uniting China, Egypt, and Africa, I think it's matching with the vision of 2030, and we should work together collaboratively just to having such kind of dream via unity and progress and sustainability. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry for having this longer. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm happy you brought up a few issues, especially the question of culture and civilization. It's important for people here in Europe. They talk about European civilization as emerging from ancient Greece. What is omitted from that is that the Egyptians and Africans taught the Greeks, mathematics, philosophy, and others. I mentioned this in an article on the water development in the Nile region, but also there's a famous Platonic dialogue called Timaeus, where an Egyptian priest, talks to Solon. Solon is the greatest mind of ancient Greece, and he said, "Oh, you Athenians you Greeks are such young people. You don't have any wise old people amongst you." And he, it's like this was reflective of how important Egypt and Africa was for the Greek civilization. Also, the question of education is that, by the way, China in 2018 surpassed both the UK and the US in the number of African students studying in China. So there are more African students studying in China than in the UK and the US. Only France is still ahead of China. One important thing is about how the world has changed so much. I give an example that African nations can take the tools of development in their own hands. When Tanzania announced the building of the Julius Nyerere Dam a few years ago, the EU, the US, the World Bank, the IMF, everybody rejected it. So who stepped in? It was Egypt and China. So Egyptian companies, they built the dam in Tanzania, which is now functioning, and they use turbines.
Yeah, the Arab contractors,
Yes.
Al-Arab.
Yes, so African companies are now capable of building the infrastructure they need. They are no longer totally dependent, but it would be helpful for us here in Europe if we participate in, for our companies to participate in this. So that's, thank you very much. We have not so much time left, actually. But I would like to ask our friend Martin Camara from Guinea.
All right. Thank you, Hussein Askari, for inviting me, for having me on the platform to discuss about Africa-China relationship. I'm Martin Camara. I'm a bioanalyst and trade and development professionals for 10 years now. Yes, my background is Guinea, West Africa, but I'm Director France for GCPET. GCPET is a global council for the promotion of international trade. So I'm representing the organization in France, and sometimes I have some meetings in Brussels, Belgium. I will be brief because the people that talked earlier, explained how the relationship between China and Africa. So I will summarize the idea and we'll move forward. China is Africa's largest trading partner for 15 years in a row since it overtook the US in 2009. African population will more than double from 1.4 billion to 2.7 billion people by 2015. Huge market for Chinese and other players. Chinese FDI in Africa has consistently outpaced that of the US since 2016. Trade between China and Africa has surged by 1,900% since 2000. A two-way trade between China and Africa stood at over 243 billion US dollars in 2022. That's 4 times what Africa trades to the US. From 2000 to 2023, Africa received 182 billion US dollar in Chinese loans, primarily for energy and transportation development. Angola, receiving 25%, was the continent's largest beneficiary, highlighting its strategic importance. Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya also ranked among the top 5 recipients, while 49 African countries have benefited. Experts have growing concerns around debt sustainability. That will be mentioned by previous speakers. But after peaking in 2016 at over 28 billion US dollars, lending to Africa dropped considerably in the past 2 years. Trends show that loan averages and amounts are decreasing, and policy framing in China is also shifting, which leads to expect less large-scale lending over 500 million US dollars. Africa will need to diversify its partners and shift away from primary commodity export to locally owned good processing industries, knowledge-based economy, boost intra-African trade that will supercharge jobs for youth and inclusive growth. In conclusion, geopolitical and economic reasons will be the driver among cooperation between China and Africa, because both will need to work together. Because Africa also needs a a capital to develop itself, and will need expertise. China could bring financial support and expertise to improve infrastructure development on the ground, to train youth on the ground, because we know the majority of the population is very young people. So it matters. That's an opportunity for Africa to get access to knowledge, to get access to expertise, and to learn from Chinese experience over the last 20 years, how they, becoming, shifting away from agrarian economy to most industrialized economy, 20 years work, in 20 years period. So Africa can learn from that, as mentioned by Dr. David Moneori. Africa sits on 65% of all Arab land, which is huge, but 3% is currently in use. 65% of all uncultivated Arab land, but 3% is currently in use. So they need to increase agri sector production to be able to provide job for youth and to rely on locally owned agro industries, to replace 100 or more than 110 billion US dollar worth of food imports, which is quite huge. So is an opportunity to learn from Chinese experience and to ramp up locally owned and to ramp up production on the ground, because we have mineral resources to do so. All mineral resources that will be used in green energy transition will come from Africa. Cobalt, lithium, copper, and fiber will come from Africa. So be able to be transform all these materials in local and be able to provide finished products will help increase increase living standards on the ground, and be able to supply the world with added value production. Currently remain at less than 2%, I think. Africa account for less than 2% of global trade. So it's an opportunity to work with Chinese, because we have they can bring expertise, and they can bring funding to move forward. So I will stop there because we are running out of time, maybe, and I let opportunity to others to also contribute to the valuable session. Thank you again, Isen Askari, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Martin. I really appreciate your presentation. Also very, very important that you pointed out, as other speakers, agricultural development is a very, very pressing issue in Africa. It's such a pity. I mean, it's unbelievable and unacceptable that African nations should import food from outside. Many nations in Africa actually have a huge trade deficit and debt because of imports of food, especially when the Ukraine crisis broke out. Many African nations were scrambling to find the grain and cooking oil because everything was imported from Ukraine and Russia. This is unacceptable for nations, and also it can fill a huge gap in their trade deficit. So anyway, I will go directly to my presentation. As you notice in this map, we connect the whole world in our vision of the Belt and Road. Nations don't need to be members in the Belt and Road, but they can cooperate, because this is very, very important for us here in Europe, and I believe also for people in the United States and other nations. We have too much talk in Europe about immigration as the biggest problem. It's not true. We have deep economic, financial, cultural, and social problems in Europe, but these are not due to immigration. These are due to mismanagement of the economy over the past 40 years. We have a process of deindustrialization, which started very long time ago, because we have abandoned the idea of industrial, scientific, and technological progress for all mankind. We believe that we reached the end of the road, the end of history, and there was no need more for development. China, Asia has proven that this is wrong. And here in the map, actually, because how do we want to revive Europe's and Sweden's economy is by participating in a new industrial revolution, a new economic revolution, which is actually will be based on the Belt and Road. You see in this map, we have two connections between Europe and Africa, and we mean it. This is not a metaphor. We have the connection between Spain and Morocco to build a tunnel for high-speed rail under the Gibraltar Strait. I recently made a video where many people were irritated. I said, you know, African youth should come to Europe in high-speed trains, not in rubber boats, you know, and drown in the Mediterranean. But African youth, Africa needs the African youth to develop Africa, but then they can come as part of the exchange between Europe and Africa, as tourists, as students, as business people, and also Europeans can go to Africa using high-speed rail. This is also a project between Italy, Sicily, and Tunisia. All these projects and 12 other major mega projects I enlist in this book, which I co-authored with other members of the Schiller Institute. It's called Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, a vision for an economic renaissance. And we list a number of very important transcontinental projects. I had the honor the last year in a major conference in Beijing to present the book to both Mr. Wang Yi personally and to Mrs. Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil, but also she is now currently the director of the BRIX New Development Bank. I will come back to that because her ideas on financing infrastructure are very important. When we talk about China-Africa relations, and is that the difference between China and Europe and the United States is that they are not trying to help Africa, they work to empower Africa, that to take the enormous human and natural resources and potential, which is important, of Africa and raise it to a higher level through building infrastructure first and foremost. As President Xi Jinping said in South Africa in 2015, he said what Africa needs to get out of there are out of poverty into industrialization is the three bottlenecks of development, which are the lack of capital, the lack of infrastructure, and the lack of skilled labor. And this is what China is focused on because China wants to have the coming 3 billion Africans as the greatest trade partner and market for its industries and technologies, not cheap products, but for high-level industrial products. As Mr. Ikena mentioned, the big problem in Africa right now is also the intra-African trade is only, now it's 16, this was several years ago. The trade between African nations themselves is only 13% of all Africa's trade. And the reason is actually not the lack of free trade agreements, but it's the lack of infrastructure. If we upgrade the infrastructure, roads, railways between African nations, the trade between African nations will increase by between 500 and 1,000%. Imagine that. This is a study from the World Bank done already in 2006. Now, to do that, to solve this problem, there's this idea by the African Union to connect all the African nations with the highways. We suggest to use railways. Is more efficient for long haulage, and it's also more energy efficient. Highways are important for shorter distances. For longer distances, high-speed rail would be preferable. So this is one of the important projects that should be put on the priority list. We have seen there are some projects which China already is building, the Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway, we have the Mombasa-Nairobi, but all these are part of the larger picture, which I said. These are not local projects, although these are national projects, but they're part of the larger integration of Africa. We can also integrate all the rivers and lakes of Africa to use them as a transport infrastructure to connect all African nations, as we have in Europe in the Danube, Rhine-Main River. You can travel by river from East Europe to Western Europe. So this is quite possible in Africa too. It's very important. One of the major issues now, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs is traveling to Chad. this is one of the major projects we have, is to save Lake Chad and the people living around it. Lake Chad, which is actually shared by several nations in Africa, has been shrinking, drying up for the last 30 years. And there's an idea which is actually generated by an Italian company many years ago, the 1970s. It's called the Transaqua project. Is to bring a small fraction, not a lot, only 5% of the water from the Congo River to the Chari River in the Central African Republic and down to Lake Chad to refill the lake. But this canal, you see here in the yellow area, it will take water from the tributaries of the Congo River, only 5%, as I said, and use this canal for navigation, but also for power generation as along its path, but also along when it reaches the Central African Republic, because you have a downward stream, you can generate power. You can use that as a navigation channel and build industrial and agricultural projects around them. There was an agreement between this Italian company and Chinese company, but not much progress has happened because there's resistance in the EU, but also in the Democratic Republic of Congo itself against this project, which the Lake Chad Commission are trying to resolve. So this is one of the key projects. The other important project, which should involve the cooperation between China and Europe and the United States, is the building of the Grand Inga Dam, because 600 million Africans out of 1.3 billion lack access to electricity. And as we know, if we want to industrialize Africa, use the natural resources in Africa for industrialization and not merely exporting all the raw materials, we need to build industries in Africa. This is one issue African leaders took up with President Xi Jinping last year, is that we can no longer export raw materials. We want to use the raw materials we have to build industries and have the added value shared by you and us. Not only we export the raw materials and we, cheaply, and we import expensive. So building the Grand Inga Dam will be a very, very important issue for African nations because it can generate around 40,000 megawatts of power. That's twice as much as the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is the world's largest dam. And this will benefit many nations, not only the Democratic Republic of Congo. President Ramaphosa of South Africa took a fight with Macron and other European leaders last year in an important conference where he said, to prove your intentions in Africa, you should start by financing this project. And Mrs. Delma Rousseff, actually, she addressed this project there was a conference in South Africa. And she mentioned this project as a key project in Africa, and the new development bank of the BRICS should be financing it. So we have to think big if we are going to achieve the goals of the African Union for 2063. As I said earlier, as many speakers said, Africa has a great potential. It's a great source of wealth for the whole world, but Africa needs to develop internally. And this should be the level of discussion between African nations, but also with the EU, with the United States, whatever people have of ideas. This is the level of discussion we need. It's beneficial for us. Our companies here in Europe can participate in these projects because China alone cannot solve all the problems of the world. We need the EU, the United States, Japan, South Korea, India, everybody to participate in this because Africa's needs and the global South needs are enormous, both in terms of capital, technology, and so on. So this is my presentation for now. And because of the shortage of time, I think what we can do is in the remaining 10 minutes, that if each speaker can answer this question, which was raised by one of our viewers. And so the question says, for years, USA and EU have pledged to invest in Africa significantly. How do you think of its delivery so far? What have they achieved so far? Question two, what is your forecast of the impact of the coming US president over Africa political and economic landscape and over the Sino-China relations? So I think we limit ourselves to that. And if I see that Ahmed raised his hand to start answering the question, all the other panelists are welcome. But please, make it like 2 minutes if possible.
Not more, not more. I'm sorry for longer for the last time, but I feel that always the problem since the 90s and maybe the 80s, since the EU or America started to have like projects in Africa, they tried to treat in a manner of a master and slave. And unfortunately, if the EU also or any other Western countries want to invest in Africa, they should resort to the United States. This is the problem. Therefore, they are not adhered in this regard. And the matter of the indebtedness is the biggest, evidence for this, because they don't want to alleviate or to giving us any discount or any reduction in this regard. And Egypt, I know, he started to impose some tariffs or extra tariffs on both Europe and Chinese. And I answered, if you remember, Dr. Hussein, this matter, even in G20 in Rio de Janeiro, Biden, he gave us some, accesses to Mr. Xi Jinping. And it was a very funny issue that he's trying to undermine or trying to make a wedge with Trump, because of course there is some sort of tacit war between the Democrats and the Republicans, as well as in Lima in the Asia Pacific summit. It was the same, and also that will help maybe Europe and China to have their own alliances in this, because they are aggrieved from the expected tariffs. And also maybe the people who are opposing, whether they are businessmen or investors in the United States, because according to such policy, this protectionism, a lot of investors will maybe leave, going to China or Mexico or other countries. That was my answer.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Ikena, yeah, unmute and please.
Yeah. All right, Oscar, thank you. Those two questions, I want to start with the last or the second question. Trump coming to US, coming to power in the next less than 2 weeks, and the fate of Africa. I don't think the fate of Africa lies in the hands of US or who manages Washington. The fate of Africa lies in the hands of Africa. I give an instance. Some years ago, President Obama was hell-bent on imposing LGBT rights on Africa, making it a creed, as if it's that what a hungry person who couldn't afford a livelihood and a medication to cure his ailment, that what he needs most is a right for gays and lesbians. Now, all African countries literally came together and resisted it, and the heavens did not fall. America pulled back, NATO pulled back. They didn't force themselves on Africa because they saw it was a dead end. So let Africa first of all go and unite itself, and they have a purpose. Like in the Sahel today, the African Sahel region, those countries are spitting fire. This fire they spit is they want to stand on their feet. Now, they were saying in the beginning that it is because it's military junta. But today, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, all in West Africa, members of ECOWAS, they are led by elected presidents, and they've started severing relationship, especially military, with France. If there could be such decisive steps among Africans, among the deprived and small countries of Asia, Oceania, and Caribbean, all of them can aggregate and take a stand and define what exactly they want, and not somebody from Washington dictating to them. That's my position on Trump. What Trump comes to do is to manage the United States of America, not Nigeria, not Sweden, not South Africa or Egypt. Now, on the second one, I think I'm old enough to know what EU, NATO, US have done in investment in Africa, if I still get the point right. Now, this is my book published last year, The Chinese in the Nigerian Economy. I think I told a lot of the story of all this lopsidedness, whereas three countries, Netherlands, the UK, and I think France, are the highest investors per net worth in Nigeria. China is the fourth largest as per portfolio investment or the value of investment. But China invests in those ways that touch the common man every day. Therefore, the investment from China is more noticeable, whereas the rest will invest in crude oil extraction that they take to their country to process. China invests in producing groceries for everyday life, building materials, lumbering, and so many other things, and building of infrastructure. So I don't know that much that those people have done in Nigeria or in Africa, other than taking those things that will benefit them most, and they go with them. So, but Africa should be open. I like what Professor David Moyai said. We are open. Bring in what you have. You don't restrict friendship. What we rather don't like is people trying to dictate to us who should be our friends and who shouldn't be. So for now, I can't remember anything of substance that from EU or from America that Nigeria counts on to move its economy. I can't remember any. Most of the things we discuss here are from China, right from our fintech, right to our ICT, that's telecommunications and the rest. The people that provide the infrastructural backbone are from Huawei, ZTE, and the rest, all in China. Africa accesses the internet, that's digital economy, 82% via mobile gadgets, and 95% of mobile gadgets used in Africa are from Asia, China first and South Korea. So we are open to accept all investments, but so far their impacts are not really noticeable or making so much meaning to the growth and advancement of Africa's economy.
Thank you very much. David, you want?
Yes. Thank you very much. I think this has been a wonderful conversation that we had. And I wish if we can continue having some of these issues. There are just few concluding remarks that I would like to make based on the questions. Firstly, Trump. Trump is unpredictable. However, unlike the first coming of Trump, the second comes at a time that we all know who we're dealing with. There won't be any surprises. So I think countries such as China, they're better prepared. I'm not sure about Africa. Prepared in the sense that the advantages and disadvantages of Trump. Let me start with the disadvantages. Trump, unlike Biden smiles at you. He tells you you're a good friend, and he does nothing. Instead of doing nothing, I mean, he and the Democrats, I think what they have done on the African continent has caused much more harm than what the Republicans have done. Just like in UK, I prefer the Conservatives than the Labour. Is assumption by Labour that we are friends, and if you see crisis on the African continent, it has more aligned to Labour than the Conservatives. So Trump is not a warmonger. I mean, he's threatening hostages to be out before his inauguration. And he's not a monger, that's one. He's racist, no doubt about it, given what he said, and I cannot repeat online about us and our continent. However, the beauty part of the man is that he leaves Africa alone in his racist kind of posture, and therefore gives us more room to do what we want to do. I think Africa is better off left alone, and therefore, if I have to choose between Trump and Biden, I'll choose Trump, as shocking, as contradictory as it comes, because of that nature. I doubt if he'll do a lot of wars. I mean, wars of choice, wars in Ukraine and Middle East, Syria, and all other military bases on the African continent. There's so much that is being done. I see a man that might try to pull out, and the disadvantage of Trump is that I think it might also come with these issues on trade. I think it's in the disruption of multilateralism. He pulled out of Paris Club, Paris, agreement, to say. World Health Organization, he pulled out UNESCO. As we are going to see that havoc. Anyway, I think we have less South Africans in the US. Unlike my brother in Nigeria, there are more Nigerians in the US. So I think we are less worried that our people will be shipped out of US. And so there's going to that chaos of immigrants, migration issues, and that chaos we're going to be felt by more. But briefly on China, I think China, Trump will see it. Every move by Trump strengthened China. His tariffs, Huawei, that my colleagues have touched on, has strengthened Huawei. Huawei is much more stronger than it was. On technology and chips, China is moving ahead. We gave them early warning, gave them ample time to prepare, and Chinese are ready. And if you look into trade in the first Trump administration and now, the Chinese have been preparing by diversifying their trade, moving away from the US and the Western world. I think if you look at trade volumes, it's shifting much more to the global south, more into Africa, Latin America, and their neighbors. I think this is in preparation for what is coming. So I do not see any leverage that US used to have on China on a daily basis, whether it's in technology, in space, or any other area. It's becoming less and less by the day. And therefore, yeah, there'll be tensions here and a lot of noise, but I wouldn't be worried about it. This is a transactional president, and we need to concentrate and do business with him in areas that we think we can do well. What are those areas? I think as much as that brings me Europe as well, I think this issue of competing with China on the African continent need to stop. I think Africa is open for business, and countries, external players, need to understand their comparative advantage. China is extremely good when it comes to telecoms. It's good when it comes to infrastructure, physical and otherwise. And we can continue doing business with China in those areas. US is also very good. It would be made for me, if I was a head of state, to bring Americans to build a rail on the African continent. I don't know, colleagues, if you've been in the US in the last 5-7 years. It's a country that is from the previous century in terms of infrastructure. Cracks on their airports, the roads, potholes, and bridges are falling apart. I wouldn't trust those people to build us airports. I prefer the Chinese rail. I prefer because they do something that is demonstrable, that I can see, and it's working. But I think Americans have a comparative advantage when it comes to pharmaceuticals. And the lessons we've learned from COVID-19 is that perhaps we need to strengthen our own global value chain, the African branch. I think we need to work on those issues and working closely with the Americans They need to come in and establish their pharmaceuticals working alongside ourselves, as much as bringing the Chinese and others. The Japanese are good in other areas. So I think my view is that we need to be pragmatic. Let's forget about ideology and all these isms, and we hate no one. We love Americans as much as we love Chinese. So whoever comes with money, we need to develop regulatory framework. We need to be hard on corruption on the African continent. We need to trade among ourselves much more than we depend on external. So I think we need to open these bottlenecks. And lastly, particularly South Africa and Nigeria. I mean, I'm always disappointed with our leaders that they seem not to get along. I think these countries are leading countries alongside Egypt and your Kenya, Algeria, Morocco, and others. Regardless of our differences, I think there is a need for these leading African countries to work quite closely and close ranks. And up to now, with the due respect, my brother, I don't understand why Nigeria is not part of BRICS. I really don't. I'm troubled by that fact that we can't have Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a much smaller country in BRICS. I mean, Nigeria should be there. And we also want to see Nigeria in G20, in a number of these countries, in the forefront, and so that we have a common position. I think South Africa is all its own ills as well. I think we need to deal with those issues among ourselves as Africans, and then we open up, but we need to speak with one voice as Africans in attracting investments from all parts of the world. I thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Martin, you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I think David Monroe is right. Ikena Imu and Ahmed Mustafa, they are right to say that Africa need to develop, or will need to develop, home ground agenda, because relationship EU, US, NATO, a missed opportunity, because 60 years and we see nothing, and people will hope that the second term of the new president, or the incoming president, Trump, will change anything regarding that. So we need to be very pragmatic, as David Monroe said, open, build on what others have done well, like Chinese, or Brazil or Latin America, to learn from their experience, to have institutional capacity, to have regulation landscape, strong regulation landscape, to tackle corruption, to have to boost intra-African trade, to work with the same umbrella like AfCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and to be able to improve region attractiveness. Because if you take Guinea, if you take Ghana, if you take Nigeria as individual countries, it won't work. They need to work under the same umbrella, 55 countries, to be able to improve. The size matters, as they say. The size matters. So they need to work under the same umbrella, AfCFTA, improve regional attractiveness and investment to boost infrastructure, as you mentioned. If you boost infrastructure, road, railway, you could, improve trade among ourselves, and inclusive growth, and turbocharge job for youth, and everything is well. African will go to Europe as a partner. European could go to Africa as partner, not by sea or by boat, but as you mentioned, through railway, through exchange program. So this is the way forward. Learn from the past. 60 years of primary commodity export did not get anything well from the people on the ground. Transform locally owned agro-processing industries, locally owned good processing industries is a way forward. And we can learn from Chinese because we have done so over the past 20 years. We're very fast, but it works. And we need to move, we need to go through the same scheme, the same approach, having a strategy, capacity building, expertise, and funding. If you don't have a capacity, we don't have strategy, and we can't attract investment. So no one will go around bring money without having any visibility. No, it doesn't work like that. We need a strategy. We need to play by book and to say, yes, it works. Others have done so, and we can because we have mineral resources. We have youth, labor. We can rely on wage advantages because of this labor force, but we need skilled workforce to do so. Investing in artificial intelligence, investing in electricity, in innovation. We can do it, but we need to have a strategy for that. A strong leadership, a strong regulation landscape to prevent any wrongdoings in future. Learn from the past and build on others' success and build our own success, our homegrown agenda, not relying on others' agenda. That's my final words. It was great to be here today.
We have to conclude, and I would like to ask Stephen to say the final words. Stephen Brower is American, Swedish, but he's also connected to Africa through his family.
Thank you, Hussein, my colleague. I was going to remark that we are both based in Sweden, but as he mentioned already, I'm spending originally half my life in the US as well as half my life in Europe. We have come together in a strategic perspective, which you see behind me, which he showed a picture of. How can we unite humanity in terms of its commitment to global development, not only one can say economically, but also in terms of culture and philosophical thinking. This is what I consider to be a strategic question, what my colleague initiated, and I only want to thank all of the participants very, very much for your input in today's seminar, or I should say webinar, which we want to continue in 2025, because I think the strategic question of the future of humanity has a great deal to do with not only China, but the initiative that China launched in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is what is the platform that we use for how one can have a framework for global development. That is something that is still not embraced by Western Europe and the United States, who still has a different idea of how they want to order and control the world. But I think that we have a great potential in 2025, and I would say that we would like to continue this kind of discussion, dialogue, and even debate in how to proceed, not alone with obviously the importance of the sovereign development of African nations, but how that plays into the global picture of how we can achieve a better future for mankind. As the president of China, Xi Jinping, said when he launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a community for a shared future for mankind. That is a premise that unfortunately is not operative in the general thinking in the power structure in the West. It's not operative despite Trump's potential for change. He is a spokesman for MAGA, America, Make America Great Again. This is not a philosophical movement unfortunately, that is based on how to build bridges. The topic that I am working on in my research, I call out of the depths of history and philosophy, emerge the Belt and Road Initiative, and then some ideas for uniting East and West, which goes into an idea of how out of studying deeper thought processes, not superficial ones, we can build bridges between continents and between civilizations. My colleague has as an Iraqi, has Sumer, you have Egypt, our representative there, and China, which I've studied in great depth. And you have a history of perhaps the oldest civilization in the world. And this is where much of what emerges out of the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a mission. It's not an aggressive mission, but it's a mission that China wishes to see the world emerge. So I think in that context, I only want to thank everyone and underline that this year, 2025, can play a major role in redefining the orientation that will perhaps maybe not be totally solved in 1 year. These things, historical things, can take time, but an orientation that will lead humanity, Africa, and the world in a direction that will be a better future for all of us. So thank you so much for all of your remarks and participation.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And thank you all our guests from Africa. I'm really happy for having this discussion. And I hope we can have even more bigger events in the future and discuss these important matters. I hereby conclude this webinar. Thank you very much for the speakers and also for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.